Speak on this topic, I'd now like to introduce our first speaker. He's a renowned linguist with a career dedicated to linguistic diversity. Welcome, Dr. Gregory Anderson.
Thanks. Nice to be here. So I should just start my presentation.
Yeah, we would love to hear. Love to hear your talk.
Perfect. And fingers crossed, given what we were having earlier, you'll see my screen and you'll see this first slide, and you do, I trust.
Yeah, we can see that. If you could create that full screen, if you play the PowerPoint, and then it will go full screen, and then you can scroll through. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So yes, thank you for that introduction. And I'm just going to very quickly go over a very complicated issue, which is explaining the distribution of language endangerment and language endangerment ecologies in Asia, because in order to understand why languages are endangered and how severely they're endangered and what methods one can do to try to change that course of history, you have to understand the environment that the endangerment occurs within. So let's see now. There we go. All right, so I'll reference several times a 6-point scale of endangerment here. Different people have different scales. This one will work for our purposes today. Essentially, the higher the number, the more healthy it is. The lower the number, the more endangered it is. So down at the bottom end of the scale, we have categories like moribund and seriously endangered. I'll explain what these mean in just a second. So threatened means basically the ecological or demographic factors are favoring shifts, so the language isn't necessarily losing speakers yet, but the conditions are ripe for that to happen. Locally endangered means that shift to a dominant language has started in some areas, but still remains the language children learn in others. Endangered means that intergenerational transmission has been broken, and we're dealing with a language that's no longer being learned by children. And then the rest of them are just kind of like how old the youngest speaker is, and it eventually gets up to great-grandparent age, and then you're dealing with only a handful of speakers in a language that's likely to go dormant or become no longer having any speakers whatsoever. Okay, if we're just looking at broadly the continent of Asia, the numbers, different people can have different numbers. This is one count that I've done based on my own research and that of other colleagues. The thing to notice here is that while there's a large number at the very endangered scale, moribund, seriously endangered, there's a lot more at the locally endangered, and threatened scale. So overall, Asia isn't as bad as some other parts of the world, but it's still not great. And so efforts there will have results. So why do they become endangered? Well, languages are endangered for a whole bunch of different reasons, but it's a set of what I would call psychosocial factors that basically dictate how valued a particular language or identity associated with the language are in a multilingual, multicultural environment. If there is a power differential between the views that are held by community members and a broader, larger, more dominant, or socially at least an economically dominant group, then you're likely to have a conflict between the views of the larger group and the views of a smaller group, which, all things being equal, is keep our own language, even if we add other ones. And you get a fear of multilingualism, et cetera, that's often cast within some kind of national sense, identity building project, et cetera. The result is that people abandon these languages because this level of discrimination is one thing you can actually get rid of if you change your language. Okay, so as it turns out, languages are not distributed evenly in terms of where and how they're endangered. So this is due to these what I call ecological factors that favor particular types of shift and particular environmental factors, social environmental, I mean here, and physical environmental to a certain degree as well, that play a role in determining whether a language is likely to become endangered or not. So we'll talk a little bit about 4 different types of patterns here. First, the one that's probably most familiar to people, which is settlement colonialist legacy. So this basically results in massive shift of languages, extreme endangerment in the present day. Then we'll talk about a very important but not very well explored pattern, which is what I call national identity construction and internal neocolonialism. So this may be no longer a colonial situation, but the dominant group basically behaves like a colonial power with respect to the internal minority groups. So this is very much a type of internal neocolonialism. Within other contexts, this in the specific context of Indonesia and the Philippines, we have had a process of essentially de-ethnicizing what was a language of a particular group, and recast it as a
Dr.
national language.
Gregory Anderson, sorry for
Yeah.
my interruption, but a lot of our audience is saying you're quite low level audio. So
Okay.
what I invite you to do is if you can maybe put your microphone a bit closer to you. And I'm sure our audience are, they've increased their volume as well. And between the two
Okay.
of us, we can make that work. Yeah.
That's fine. Am I being heard now?
I can hear you perfectly, but some people won't. So let's continue and see.
Okay.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Sorry about that. Somewhat confused by that, but all right. So, the last thing I was going to mention briefly was looking at a particular type of neocolonialist pattern under the guise of so-called development schemes for minorities in India. There's also another type, which I won't talk about here, which is the trade exploitation colony legacies, which basically promote middleman languages or contact languages, like the advancement of Tok-Pisin in New Guinea. This often is a fairly modern phenomenon with urbanization of populations and this lingua franca that was established in the colonial period becoming the dominant language. Okay, so just looking at the global distribution of language endangerment, we see that there are certain areas where you find higher concentrations. We're looking at the Asian part of the map here. If we turn to this map, what we see is a sort of a heat map, if you will. So green is more healthy end of the endangerment scale, and red is a more severely endangered set. So you can see that the red is concentrated in settlement colonies, Australia, South America, North America, and Siberia, but also in a couple of other places, Taiwan, for example. So the consequence of settlement colonialism is, as I said, massive language shift, and the representation of this we'll see is in Asia is from Siberia. So if we looked at Siberia in the 17th century, what we saw was large areas dominated by different ethnic groups. If we look at the 21st century, what we find is languages often confined to single villages, and at that, often just a small portion of the elderly population who speak the languages. So there's been massive contraction and language loss in Siberia as a result of the settlement colony legacy. So in all of these areas, we can talk about different hierarchies of languages, and this essentially means how likely and more endangered the languages are. So Russian is a stable language, it's healthy, it's the target language of shift. And then as you go down this list, you see lower and lower status languages and languages which are more and more likely to be nearly extinct. And in the case of languages like Chulim and Khizil, we're talking about fewer than 20 speakers for sure that still remain alive, and in a couple of these cases, probably fewer than 10. All right, now turning to a different situation entirely, we're going to look at Indonesia. So Indonesia is a complicated and complex language area where there's hundreds and hundreds of languages. And then on top of that, we have this constructed national identity, Bahasa Indonesia, this language. And for a long time, that was aggressively promoted through policies of like moving populations around, transmigrasi, they call it, so that you could essentially force people to speak Bahasa Indonesia. But recently, there's been some movement as the government, I guess, has felt comfortable with national identity being constructed so that they're given some space for other languages to promote themselves. But Indonesia has a very complicated ethnic picture. So this is just a mosaic representative of how diverse it is. In addition to Bahasa Indonesia, we have several very large regional languages. This is Javanese being the most the widely spoken, I guess, or the largest of them. But several of these languages are all very important regional languages. And one of the things that we see in Indonesia is shifts that go along this hierarchical list. Basically, the lower you are, the more likely you are to be shifting to one language above. And the hierarchies of identities in Indonesia interplay a few different complex things. So central versus periphery. This is what you'd expect in an internal neocolonialist situation. We also have urban versus rural and lowland versus upland. So the more upland a community is, the lower value it has, and the more restricted it is. Also, there's a religious hierarchy of Muslim, Christian, Hindu, animist. Also, there's a physical racial hierarchy that's used in identifying different degrees of how valued the language and the identity is. So Austronesian over Papuan phenotypes. So what we do see in Indonesia is these really interesting chain shifts of, so language is lower on the hierarchy, shifting to one rank right above it. So fourth to third, third to second. Second level languages are still endangered, even though they have millions of speakers, because their speakers are in fact shifting to Bahasa Indonesia as a form of upward mobility, et cetera. So we have the Indonesian language hierarchies really show themselves in these chain shifts. Turning now to Southeast Asia, what we have here is what I call the Stalinist legacy of minority language policy in China and Vietnam. Stalin's view of ethnicity, which became codified in the Soviet Union, is essentially derived from Lewis Henry Morgan's view of social structure and ethnic groups and social groups. And this sort of endures in a lot of people's ideas of what it is to be an ethnic group. So this means you're supposed to have a separate language, a separate area, a designated space, some kind of cultural practice, and a mindset, whatever that means. In practice, across countries in Asia that have official minorities, you often get a grouping of people together in their perceived degree of otherness from the standard group, the majority population. Often clothing is a primary determinant for this, and this is one of the ways that tribalness or minorityness can be expressed in state-sanctioned venues, is to display your traditional clothing. Basically what happens is you get a hierarchy that's been established in these states in Asia where you get the majority dominant language, and then these official ethnic minority languages, and then the small official ethnic minority languages, and then below that are all these unofficial languages. And we're often dealing with quite a few of the unofficial languages with respect to the official languages. So again, like we saw in Indonesia, we have various factors that play a role in determining whether a language will be more or less valued. So the higher you come from the hills, the more likely your language is to be devalued. What we do see in these countries is a popular discourse that infantilizes the minority peoples, treats them as children of the big brother state, if you will, sexualizes them. So often images are of women only from the ethnic groups, and their dehistoricization. So they want them to sort of be quaintly static in their historicity for state purposes, but largely they want them to assimilate and become modern, except for when it serves state purposes to show that they're an inclusive state, if you will. So this is the type of images that you see dominating ethnic minorities in this part of the world. This one happens to be from China. You'll notice they are all women. So China, the distribution of official versus unofficial is about 5-to-1. Unofficial versus official minority. So there's a lot more languages in China than there are official peoples there. So unsurprisingly, if a language is unrecognized, it's not going to get developed. It's a lot more likely to be in danger. So here's an example of the infantilization that you'll see. So this is all little children, basically. That's the typical representation that we see of minority people. Okay, Vietnam pretty much just followed China in its policies and actually has almost exactly the same number of official ethnic minorities, but here it's only like a 2-to-1 discrepancy for the most part. Okay, now lastly, looking at India. So India is an interesting situation because the majority Hindu population in India is experiencing a post-colonial reality. So they no longer are under the British Raj. They no longer are a colonial state in that sense. However, the dominant Hindu populations in India have just stepped into the role of colonial power and have simply enforced their own policies and ideologies and other forms of identity expression onto the lower status groups, some of whom are called tribal. Now, tribal in India is a very complicated concept that's very hard for outsiders to get their head around, because first of all, it's defined on a state level. So you can be a tribal community on one side of a border, but on the other side not, if you're not recognized as such. And these are the official things in the Constitution that determine tribalness: indications of primitive states, backwardness, etc. How these things are quantified is completely absurd. You can't quantify primitive traits or backwardness. Okay, so these are inherently racist and inherently exclusionary, and also completely, can never be applied in any kind of rational way. The language family that I've worked on the most in India is the Munda language family. They're all tribal people. They're all very low status tribal people. So they rank amongst the lowest of the low in the most complicated ethno-linguistic hierarchized state in the world. Again, we see the same types of things. This is a really dry, boring book about sustainable development among the Diday Gata people. So what do you choose? You choose a young woman smiling on your cover. Okay. Primitive tribes of Orissa, again, basically women. You've got a guy in the background who's hidden sufficiently. Otherwise, you have, sexualized imagery of women. The primitive tribes of India encyclopedia, you get the impression that perhaps there are no men in these communities. So like we saw with the infantilization and sexualization, you also get this sort of exoticization of tribalness when it serves state purposes. So you often have these fairs where people are allowed to express their tribalness, do dances, have their tribal clothing and stuff, but mainly they just want to have these people assimilate, go to schools where they speak Indo-Aryan languages, do Hindu religious practices, drink milk rather than slaughter cows, et cetera, et cetera. So their attempt to get the tribal out of them as much as possible, except for when it serves the state purposes. Okay, so India, as I mentioned, is a very hierarchical group. The languages that we work down are here in the 5, 6, and 7: scheduled tribal, literate tribal, and illiterate. Primitive and backwards are particularly vulnerable tribal languages. And even the terminology is just, infused with racist ideologies. So just to remind us and summarize, so this is the 6-point scale that we reference when we talk about levels of endangerment in a particular area. 1 being very endangered, 6 being threatened, so not quite endangered. And when we turn to the areas that we just looked, what we see is in Siberia, we have an average rating of 1.9. So that's extremely bad. Okay, so the vast majority of Siberian languages will lose their speakers in this century. Almost all of them, in fact. So then we have a much less situation in the rest of the countries, where it's more between locally endangered and endangered. So what this means is that we can still implement measures that will help turn the tide, and just summarizes what we saw. So if it's imperialist subjugation and racist ideologies, you get massive shift. The national majority languages have these different sort of hierarchies I talked about, which involve urban, rural, upland, lowland, et cetera. And these are the hierarchies that will determine where on the endangerment scale you're likely to find yourself if you belong to one of these ethnic minorities. And with that, thank you very much. I know that was a lot of information.
No, that was absolutely fascinating, and particularly fascinating when we see it broken down like that, all the different elements influencing, what contributes to these languages being heading towards extinction. There's so many things at play, as you said, colonialism, political, and so on. So thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Now, we've had many requests for your slides. So if it's possible, please do share them with LC Agency so that they can be distributed, because it's absolutely fascinating information. If that is that possible?
Well, it will be. I will say this is, basically comes from a book I'm writing right now. So I'll figure out to what degree I could share what. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to let people have this information, because it's here. So that's just as long as it's understood that it's sort of in that context, that I am actively working on a project.
No, that's absolutely. Maybe you could edit it and send through something which you feel comfortable with to LC, so that we can share that. That'll be absolutely great. Thank you so much for your insights. Absolutely fascinating. Really appreciate it. And I just want to highlight that LCE agency are really committed to this, the preservation of language. And as such, they, donate money to this cause. And not only that, they're really proactive in keeping the Sylheti language alive and well. And I just wanted to put that to you all.